As we know, Trump is a very dedicated tweeter, and he's only tweeted about Venezuela once in the past month or so. There's an obvious explanation for this change in focus, and that is Iran. Iran has clearly replaced the Venezuelan crisis as the focal point of news about of international news and news about foreign policy. On the other hand, domestically, the more pressing issue of the day is still related to Latin America, but has less to do with Venezuela in particular, and that's the issue of migration from Latin America and the really appalling conditions that have been revealed in the migrant detention facilities. There's also been some really interesting news to come out just again in the last few days, which suggests that President Trump is bored. The Washington Post quoted a former official who claimed that Trump and the people around him assumed that Venezuela would be easy to overthrow. This official said that Trump thought of Venezuela as low-hanging fruit, and the victory would be quick, and it would be he would be able to score easy political points. Now, when that revolution did not happen, when Juan Guaido failed to convince the military to turn against Maduro, it seems that Trump lost interest. That's hard to say. It seems that the more likely response is going to be perhaps the exact opposite, which is sanctions, which is a kind of schizophrenic approach. On the one hand, to critique the humanitarian conditions in Venezuela, and on the other hand, to impose ever stricter sanctions. That seems to be the more plausible response in my view. One thing that the mainstream media does that I think has a quite detrimental effect on American public opinion is it portrays not only Venezuela, but much of Latin America in a very unhistorical and decontextualized way. There is almost no mention, it's very rare to find in the mainstream media evidence of the United States' long and not particularly good history in Latin America, especially when it comes to propping up authoritarian governments or aiding coups against elected governments. In fact, what is rarely mentioned in the contemporary context is that the United States was probably involved in the failed coup against Chávez in 2002. It's a long story. This crisis in Venezuela is a long and developing story, but we only get little pieces of it. Even at the time, the coverage of the coup in 2002 was very problematic. The tendency was to present the opposition again as peaceful and democratic, and it was against a violent dictator. Even the New York Times in 2002 responded to the coup by saying, well, this has made Venezuelan democracy stronger and it has ousted a dictator. And then later, when it turned out that the coup did not have popular support, they sort of retracted that story. Nonetheless, this rather simplistic story of democracy versus dictatorship still dominates the coverage today. Latin America is clearly very important to Trump and to the Trump administration, but it's a very particular picture of Latin America. It's Latin America as it appears to Americans who feel besieged by Latin American migrants. It should not be forgotten that Trump began his presidential campaign with his infamous remarks about so-called Mexican rapists coming over the border and criminals and so on. And to show, and this figure of the Mexican actually suggests how little Trump and his supporters really think about or know about Latin America. Are all sort of, in the United States, the Mexicans sort of figured as everyone from south of the border. And so that issue is clearly important to him, but it's what's more important is the perceived threat at the American border than I think the actual politics and realities of daily life in Latin America.